Yes? Yes, Thais is very punctual, right? So let's... Okay, so all right, so let's begin then. So hello everyone, good morning from Belo Horizonte, Brazil. Good afternoon to some of you. So welcome to this last day of the first international meeting of researchers in intermediality, an event organized by the research groups Intermidia, Estudo sobre a Intermidialidade, and Intermidialidade, Literaturas, Artes e Mídias, and hosted by Universidade de Santa Cruz do Sul, UNISC. And so on behalf of the organizing committee, I would first like to thank our three guests who come from different parts of Europe and who have so kindly accepted our invitations to share their experiences with us today. And I'm sure it will be a very rich moment of exchange. And so we are going to have the three presentations, okay? I think, is it okay if we have Clodagh first, and then Janine, and then Mattia's? Yeah, is it okay? Yes. And then we hopefully will have some few minutes at the end, so we can debate, we can discuss, we can answer some questions if you may have. Okay. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today. And so without further ado, then I would like to present our first guest. So Clodagh Brook is professor in Italian at Trinity College Dublin. She holds a PhD at Oxford University, bachelor, master's degree at University College Dublin. She was reader at the University of Birmingham before taking up her position at Trinity College in 2017. And she has published widely on Italian poetry and cinema, and she lectures in film, 20th and 21st century literature, and Italian culture. Is that correct, Clodagh?
That's more or less it. Thank you very much for the introduction. That's very kind. And thank you very much for inviting me as well to this. It's really good to have this opportunity to get to know people in this field a bit more. We've been encouraged, I think, to talk informally today, so I will put on a PowerPoint at some point, but really I just want to chat a little bit about what my research really is and take you along the path of intermedial studies, which is what we were asked to sort of talk about as well. So my own introduction to intermediality, I would say that it was startling, sudden and late. So I'd worked on both poetry and cinema during my career in an Italian department in Birmingham in the UK. And my intellectual grounding is in Anglophone modern languages, which when I was first studying it was a pretty more or less watertight disciplinary essentiality, really grounded in the philological study of literature. So that watertight boundary was slipping fast at the start of the 2000s, but it hadn't quite slipped yet. So one day, I guess my start with intermediality is 2010, and I was standing in an exhibition in the Barbican in London in front of a multimedial set of early 20th century artworks, including Dada. And I realized I did not have the language to talk about them. Now, as a linguist and someone who works with language, realizing that I was silent in front of these artworks, I think was really the start of what became the interdisciplinary Italy project. In my head, at least, I hadn't communicated with anyone else at that stage. So I think Lars was talking about yesterday about having a long kind of, since childhood, really having a relationship with intermediality. But mine was more like a James Joyce epiphany in front of a picture, I think. So that was my moment of understanding, really. And I think I realized at that point that modern languages in modern languages, almost nobody at that stage was actually talking about intermediality. No one had the language to talk about intermedial studies. And no one had the language to talk about the in-between, and yet we were increasingly researching intermedial forms of cultural production at the time, like videos and comics and social media of various kinds. So we didn't have the, I suppose, the theoretical and methodological structure to support the work beyond a bit of text and image studies, which was being done not in Italian studies, but in French studies. They were doing image and text. So it's very slow. Intermediality in modern languages is very slow in being absorbed into the work that we're doing. We weren't teaching the tools as well at this stage back in 2010, which are necessary for a changing trade, and we weren't really teaching a new intermedial object to our younger colleagues, and we simply weren't taking enough account, I think, or enough notice of the intermedial complexity of literature and film, which were our two big objects of research at that time, and looking at their intermediality as well. So these were things that I felt were missing in our field. And I'm just going to share very briefly, I'm not going to use a PowerPoint too much today, but I'll share very briefly a PowerPoint at this point. So really, I got in touch with two people I knew from Oxford, who are both really brilliant scholars. One of them is Florian Musnug, who's in UCL, and the other one is Giuliana Pieri, who's in Royal Holloway in London. These are two scholars of Italian studies, but one had been working on music and the other had been working on art. So we decided to work together at that stage. We got funding from the British Arts and Humanities Council, quite a lot of it in the end, and we've worked together very closely for almost a decade at this stage. And the project has also expanded really quite a lot due to really quite a number of postdocs that we have in through the HRC, through the Marie Curie, and through the Irish Research Council. So we're very lucky to have these people in Trinity. We're delighted to have them all, really. In Trinity, working with us on a project that centres on Italy, but has quite a dynamic feel to it on bringing intermediality within Italian studies. So that's really where we are on that. Sorry, I've probably gone ahead of myself here. So we're kind of moving in that direction, really. And an interdisciplinary Italy project is in many ways really small and really niche, as it centres just on Italy. But it's had a lot of interest and a lot of traction nonetheless, because it's quite unique still within modern languages. We've been running summer schools for postgraduates, and this year we had Henry Jenkins with us and Massimo Riva from Brown University. We've had a conference, we've had an exhibition in London, we've had workshops in New York and London and Rome. We've been producing a little bit of teaching material for schools, and I want to come back to that at the end. We have a blog where we kind of post fortnightly, and have visited rather a lot. And of course, we've written articles and books as well, and I'll leave a bibliography at the end of the PowerPoint for you as well. So what I wanted to show you here is, and I said I'd talk about this as well when I was talking today, is actually to say a little bit about the ISIS conference and the sixth one, which we'll be running in Trinity. Because I think quite a number of you here will probably have an interest in this, and we're very close to actually launching the call for papers, which will be next week. So it's called In Between and Across, New Directions, Mappings and Contact Zones. And it's focusing on concepts of in-betweenness, which Agnes was talking about yesterday, and which I increasingly think is really central to the work that we're doing on intermediality, and also a moving across. So these two spatial metaphors capture the tension between stasis and fluidity, that underlies all intermediality. And we've grounded the conference, I think, in geographical and spatial metaphors, mapping spaces, charting directions, understanding better in between spaces and what's inside and outside of them. And there are going to be 4 parts to that conference. It'll take place to the 1st and the 3rd of September in 2022 in Trinity in person, we hope, if at all possible, and certainly that's the plan at the moment. So in between and across disciplines, this is what Lars talked about yesterday, really. Is or should intermediality be self-enclosed, a discipline in itself, striving to grow with its own kind of borders and strengthening its own grounds, or should it develop in a much more sort of, I suppose, tentacular way, which infiltrates, other disciplines? The conference, I think, will give us that space to discuss that in detail. I think it's an important question at this point for us all. So I'm looking forward to talking to people about that in more detail at the time. Also, in between and across geographies, ecologies, and cultures, this is something that probably comes from our own sort of background in the modern languages in many ways, because researchers on intermediality and transnationalism have both been looking at the questions of of contact zones and of borders, but we haven't really brought these 2 discourses together. So it's an opportunity to actually do something and bring those discourses together, looking at the intermediality and the local, national, transnational, and global processes, really. So that's another part of what we'll be doing. And then the arts, in between and across arts, and in between and across technologies, which I think is completely self-explanatory and very well established. So what I'd like you to do, that if you're interested in being involved in this, that we consider putting together panels, and this would be a good place. We have a good group of people here through this network now to think about panels, but we'll also open a space on the ISIS site so that you can get together with others with shared interests. And also roundtables, we'll be in touch with some people, but if you have a research group and you want to do a roundtable, please get in touch with us about that. So if the organizers are okay with this, I'll send around some details as well afterwards through you in Brazil, about this, because I think it's probably worth showing this to the network as well. So that's that. In terms of, you asked us to think about guiding questions. So for our own project, and I think the guiding question for our own project really is, why has intermedial practice changed so markedly? And we're looking at a particular time period from 1900 onwards, right up to the contemporary period in Italy. So it's a large and extremely complex why question, but targeted on a particular particular country, I suppose. And so if Agnes was talking and has talked in her research really about 3 approaches to intermediality in the field: the classificatory, the tracking of the history of media relations, and a detailed analysis of intermediality in the text, our emphasis, I think, in this project definitely falls on the second of those, which is the tracing of media relations, really. So this is a work which challenges and amends established ideas of cultural centres and of peripheries in modern languages disciplines, to map new encounters and experimentation as well. And what we're doing in this project is to focus both on individuals and groups which are actively engaged in boundary crossings, on institutions which fostered or which hindered intermediality, and also to look at artworks which don't fit the disciplinary mold really and risk falling into the gaps between disciplines. So that in a nutshell is kind of what we're working on right at the moment. What I'm supposed to be finishing as I speak really is a book, and it's a very complicated book about intermedia in Italy. It's a very complex thing to try and write a sort of cultural history of intermediality in Italy, and I'm quite happy to go into the details of how we thought through such a ridiculous task and how we went about sort of, I suppose, going about facing such a complex task. But our work anyway is rooted in the hypothesis that there are ever closer relationships between artistic practices, and that this is a key cultural force driving creativity since the start of the 20th century, especially, I think. So we're identifying this as a paradigm shift in the 20th century. And I think there's therefore kind of an urgent need to understand and map a national process as well as a larger, more general process. So to look at the national processes of this as well. So there's a lot of excellent and original work that's already been done. So our work is really a work of mapping the change, trying to uncover the reasons for that change and producing an overarching frame, however incomplete and kind of provisory really that's going to be. Now I'm not going to share very much, I just wanted to show you that. So I'll go back to the main kind of screen now, but really, I suppose that's the nub of what we're in this project. So you asked us as well to talk about our intellectual reference points. It's very easy to put reference points in place after you've done something and to create a narrative that isn't really there. I think I'm probably with Lars on this one, that it's a mess of different influences. We actually started extremely broad, as you can tell from the title of the project, which was Interdisciplinary Italy. We actually started with a very broad notion of interdisciplinarity and what that meant, and quite a focus on disciplinary identities, actually. So from that, we've tried to bring some order, I think, to that chaos. And whatever I say here is going to be very simplistic, but I think it's probably worth kind of putting down our own kind of foundations here as well. So our conception of intermediality, I think, owes a great deal to the vibrancy of Dick Higgins. His creative understanding of intermediality as radical experimentation in the 1960s, in the Fluxus era, basically. And for Higgins, much of the best artwork being produced was obviously falling between media. And this critical apparatus, with his roots in the Renaissance separation of the arts, just had in his eyes simply failed to deal with the hybrid forms like concrete poetry or happenings. So in this context, intermedia was both experimental practice and a critical tool for understanding artworks that might otherwise appear opaque and impenetrable, because sitting outside the established boundaries of art and media, really. So Higgins stresses the idea of the flux in experimentation, and we were quite interested both in ideas of flux and in experimentation, which is probably the center to a lot of our work, how intermedia intersects with experimental creative practices. And that's pointing towards a constellation of moving alliances and intersections between the arts and media. It's a fluid field that tends to recreate boundaries once new intermedial forms become more established. So our focus takes impetus, I think, from Higgins in its charting of a relationship between intermedial experimentation and its normalization, and this tension between opposing impulses towards stability and instability. I was working particularly in the 1990s, which is a period, in fact, of stabilization of intermediality. So we're working in a historical way in terms of these waves, I think, of intermedial experimentation, how they rise in Italy with perhaps futurism at the start of the century, and how they grow still and how they petrify at other points before against, I suppose, freeing themselves and moving onwards towards a fresh crest, really. I'm very cautious about Higgins, as I'm sure most of you here would be. His ideas can lead to utopian discourses of ideal freeness, which belie the dissension and this disparity at the origin of things, as well as missing the power that inheres in the creation of intermedia, a power which is particularly obvious to us in Italian studies when we look at fascism, because fascism used intermedial production as part of its discourse in the totality of things. So we're very aware, I think, of the relationships between power and intermediality and the way in which intermediality has been used both for good and for not good at other points. I think we've also done a lot of thinking about some of the categories that Agnes was talking about yesterday. I'm sorry I couldn't get to the evening, which is why I'm not kind of citing people in the evening when I couldn't get to it yesterday evening. But when Agnes was talking yesterday, she's talking about the boundaries really. And when our project started, I think we had a discourse that was firmly rooted in the discourse around borders, about who polices the media and artistic borders, who polices disciplines, how they're interwoven with power, how do you cross borders. So it's a very geographical metaphor which rings true, as I've said, in modern languages, where the discussion of national borders is a really important one. But I was struck by what Anya said yesterday about how she moved from the discourse of borders to in-betweenness. And in the intermedial debate, I think it's the idea of in-betweenness that's actually become central to us as the project developed. And I know that Lars too is kind of curious about how one can find the gaps between the different media. For him, what the intermediality has to offer is the bridging of these gaps, or simply, I hope I'm not misciting you here, Lars, but a better understanding of what happens in the in-between space of media. So our discussion of in-betweenness entails kind of revisiting and revising conceptual systems that are based on, I suppose, that are based on concepts of fixity and linearity and center and hierarchy, and exploring the in-between. For us, I think refocuses attention on the discussions of networks and of nodes and of boundary crossings. And also I think what lies on either side of this in-betweenness, which is always called back into question again. And another central metaphor, which I think has emerged more recently in the work that we've been done, particularly towards the end of the project, or the end of this phase of the project anyway, is the idea of contact zones. Crossing, I think, can resemble territorial conquest. Rather than free creative space that was imagined by Higgins. So for Henry Giraud, for example, he talks about thinking in terms of borders, which allows you to critically engage the struggle over those territory spaces and contact zones where power operates to either expand or to shrink the distance and connectedness among individuals, groups, and places. So this reference that Giraud has as contact as a site of power is also central to another critic that we've used more recently, which is Mary Louise Pratt and her notion of the contact zone. And we found this quite productive for our work. And the contact zone is a site which facilitates exchange between a dominant and less dominant power in the imperial context. So again, it's coming from post-colonial sort of discourses here. And it's most fundamental. It shows that in the colonial context, one of spatialized and racialized domination, cultures meet and they clash and they grapple with each other, often in contexts which are highly asymmetrical, I think, in relation to power. So this is a concept, the contact zone is a concept which I think has traveled across disciplinary contexts. And for us, it's been helpful, I think, in understanding media board. I wanted to say a word here about something that I find difficult about intermediality. And one of the challenges, I think, for us, at least in the kind of Irish English perhaps American background, intellectual background, where we're asked to think a lot about outreach and how the university actually talks to the world outside. And it's something I wanted to raise here actually with us and maybe start a conversation on it in some form or another. But we have a highly intellectual and often taxonomically challenged field or non-field of intermediate studies. And can we, or should we, or do we take it out into the world beyond academia? The organisers very kindly suggested that we talk about education and how that fits in with our brief here. But I actually think the challenge needs to go beyond education. And the question for me is our work on intermediality somehow too enclosed, talking back in borders again, but somehow too enclosed and too theoretical to be of use to the general public or to school children specifically. And it would worry me, I think, if my work on intermediality didn't enter into a contact zone with the kind of goes beyond the academic world and out into the public world in some sort of way. In our own project, we've worked with artists, and I think that worked well on the whole. I can obviously say more about that, but I'm not going to go into detail here. I'm just giving an overview, really. We did try to bring intermediality into schools, which was far more challenging than we thought it was when we wrote it down on a grant application for a series of reasons that, again, I won't go into today. But it was part of our brief, and it remains part of our brief, really, is to look at that intersection between intermediality and education. And we never found it particularly easy to knit into our teaching outside of the university. Inside of the university, it's much easier. I'd like to mention here the work of Giuliana Pieri, who's my longtime collaborator on the Interdisciplinary Italy project. She has made efforts to take this work outside of the university with a number of projects that she's done, including the most recent one, which is called Curating Narratives. And here she took museum curatorship, which are things like selection and display and interpretation, into the classroom in order to try to show the power of the intersection between visual and textual and dialogic narratives. And students, what happened in that was that students and participants of these workshops became curators, and they were given the task to select visual material and devise kind of visual narratives in their section of wall space and present their curatorial choices, I suppose, to other participants and try and get their interpretative skills and presentation skills up. It's a very interesting project, I think. But I wonder where else we might go with outreach, or let me put it another way, what is the benefit for society for of our intermediate work, which we are also so fond of and so interested in. So what's the benefit of that beyond the university, really? So really, I think to sum up, I think the larger questions that this work has raised with me is about the embedding of intermediality into a range of disciplines and how that works and how that can be done, what it means for those disciplinary identities, how we can talk through those disciplines then to the world beyond the academic ones. Those are some of the big themes that I think come out from some of the work that we're doing at the moment. With that, I'll end. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Clodagh, for the great presentation, and I think you raised some important issues there, some ideas for us to perhaps pick them at the end of our session. I surely wrote down some points here, some notes here. So if we have some time, I would ask you. But so we move forward now to our second presentation. So Janine Hauthal, okay, is Assistant Professor of Intermediate Studies and Postdoctoral Fellow at Vrije Universiteit Brussels, PhD in English from the University of Gießen. And she worked as a research assistant and assistant professor at the Universities of Gießen and Wuppertal. And her research focuses on contemporary literatures in English, intermediate studies, cultural and transmedial narratology, genre theory, meta-reference, post-traumatic theater, post-colonial aesthetics and fiction, and Brexit fiction. Okay, so thank you, Janine, for being here with us today. So yeah, so you may please begin your presentation, your talk. So thank you very much again.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much also for inviting me here. I have a PowerPoint, I will try to share my screen, just a second. Go to the beginning. Okay, I hope you can see this. Is it working? Am I loud enough?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
all right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, I'm representing a country, I thought a little bit, and this is a very special country. So as you just heard, I'm affiliated with the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. And we are not supposed to translate this name into English. So I'm not supposed to say Free University of Brussels, because as you can see on the slide, then this would be the same name as our French counterpart, the Université Libre de Bruxelles. So in this country, in this trilingual country, you have here an overview where all the universities are, and also which languages are being spoken. And I think that this is something that I come from Germany, found always very interesting, in the sense that there's already something that causes intermediality to be very present, and translation to be very present in everyday life in Belgium, because a lot of artworks in the cinema are subtitled, for instance. So you have a lot of intermediality that comes from this multilingualism. Now, I myself, I'm chair of a center that's called Center for Literary and Intermediate Crossings. And in this research group, there are nearly 50 researchers working in 6 languages, but also in theater studies. And we have focused our research mainly on 3 strands of research. That's media, genres, and spaces. So we do mainly explore, let's say, classical media, literature, theater, performance, and film. And we look at interactions between these media or media systems. There's also a strong interest in genre, and then especially in generic hybridity in the research at our center. So there is a lot of research looking at the crossing of genre conventions, and very often this is actually something that ties in also with the crossing of conventional media borders, so the radio play, the prose poem, or documentary fiction. And then space, as we've just heard, is also very present in the sense that being in Brussels, in the heart of Europe, as I said, in a trilingual state, Brussels is a very multilingual city, and intermediality and multilingualism are 2 specialisms that also the university is putting forward in recent years. So there is a lot of research also on Brussels or other transnational spaces. I myself, as you will also see later, worked a lot on Europe as a transnational space in literature and other media. There's also a lot of research going into border regions where, so really at the in-between that is explored. Now, if you have like Belgian literature in Belgium and these border regions, that's something that colleagues of mine are working on. Then, yeah, there are certain activities that we do. There's an annual symposium, and you see that this intermediate, literary and intermediate, comes back in a lot of these titles. The final day that we had online, unfortunately last year, or fortunately, because we had a lot of international participants, we always have, but this time there were even more, on seriality. And should that be something you're working on? I think it's still possible to contribute. There is still a call for papers or call for articles out there. Then just to give you a brief overview of what people have been working on, I've already mentioned some of this. So intermediate literature, literature and music. Then there was some research also on the radio play, and one of these research days that we organized also resulted in a volume on campus fiction, but where we also really try to look not just at literary campus fiction, but also online campus fiction, films, series, and so on. Yeah, that's, yeah, I think, I put it on this slide. So the deadline for the issue is still ongoing for 15th of October. Then there are also, I would like to briefly talk about what are ongoing research projects. There will be a conference organized by Caroline van Neerum on narrative and music. Then there is a postdoc of a colleague of mine who's working on gestures and the intersection between genre, narrativity, and the performance of gestures in German language, drama, and theater. And we also have a PhD student looking at lyric art criticism, so really how criticism imitates the artworks that it is evaluating. So it's all about these hybrid or border crossing phenomena that we try to focus on. Then you have here a list of the center's national and international partners and networks that I will maybe not read out in full. You see that there is also, that theater is coming back, spectacle culture, the neo-avant-garde, experimental literature, as Clodagh also mentioned, is something that's interesting. And 20th Century Crossroads is a research center that also looks at mass media in particular. And that's also something that's interesting for us. Then, as I said earlier, the university or the faculty is trying to profile in recent years, especially research on intermediality and on multilingualism in the linguistics side of the department. Multilingualism is a specialism, whereas for us it's intermediality. There has been a new assistant professorship in intermediality, which is basically my post now. We've also started a new initiative that's called the Laurent Chair in Intermediality Studies. And this year we had Alexandra Zemmer as the first chair. Next year it will be Andreas Fickers from the University of Luxembourg. We are also organizing a lecture series, and we were so fortunate to welcome Lars with us, and also Birgit Neumann, and also Alexandra Zemmer, also from Paris 8, also gave a lecture. And there was also, for the first time, a spring school for PhD students with contributions by Peter Buse and Gabriele Rippel, and also Alexandra Zemmer. Then another activity that may be of interest also for you or for anybody working in the field of intermediality studies is a journal that we founded. It's online, it's multilingual. You can send in contributions in 6 languages. It is peer-reviewed and open access. You can see the issues that have been published so far and the ones that are in the process of being published. So we usually have an open call where once in a while. We first thought every year, but we have to see how this actually develops. And you can also submit suggestions for guest edited special issues. So should that be something that you're interested in? So for instance, next year there will be one about depicting destitution across media with scholars, guest editors from Graz. So we are very open to that and look forward to receiving any proposals you may have. And if you have more questions, please do contact me. Then let's maybe also move beyond. You already had the list of partners. There's of course much more intermediality research going on than just what we do in CLIC and at Brussels. I'm sure you are aware of Image and Narrative, and which is edited amongst others by Jan Bartens from the KU Leuven. There's also, I think, a very interesting other research center, the Research Center for Visual Poetics at the University of Antwerp, where they also have now a huge interdisciplinary project called Be Magic, where they look at the magic lantern and its cultural impact as a visual mass medium in Belgium. And because we were asked to reflect on education, I just thought that it's maybe interesting for you to know that at Brussels we have a multilingual master's in linguistics and literary studies. And one of the profiles in this master, it looks maybe a bit complex, I don't know, with the different languages you can study. So the 6 that we have the disciplines, and then there are additional languages, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian, that you can also choose from as additional models. But there are basically these 6 profiles, and intermediality is one of them. So you can really focus also on intermediality studies in this 1-year master. And yeah, now I will talk about my path and the question what actually brought me to Brussels. And I don't know, I tried to draw a kind of not a straight path, because I think that wouldn't really describe my path. You heard already a little bit of my background. So I think that my academic biography is maybe a bit different in the sense that I studied something very broad. I studied in Gießen applied theater studies, or as it's also called, theater, film, and media. And it's modeled on the Anglo-American model of the drama department. But in the case of Gießen, this actually means that you study 12 subjects. So I studied not just all the literatures. So I took courses in all the literatures, but also law and economics and philosophy and psychology and film studies. And so it's really was a very broad and very interdisciplinary way of studying. So, and then, I started my PhD also at Gießen University. And at that time, they were founding one of the first graduate centers in the field of the humanities. And I was so lucky to then work together and chair we had a lot of doctoral research groups. And the group I was working with was called Intermidiality or Mediality, Theatricality and Performativity. And we basically could ask for money to organize all kinds of activities. And that's, I think the very first masterclass we organized was with Irina Rajewski, but we also had Joachim Pech there, Martin Seel, Andreas Hetzel, and Dieter Mersch. Then I was also a member of a center called Media and Interactivity, which then studied newer media than what I did during my studies. Because my PhD was focused on metadrama and theatricality, I also organized a conference that was called Metaization in Literature and Other Media, where then Werner Wolf basically, I would say, presented what later became his project on meta-reference in a nutshell. So there were these links. And what I would also like to say is that I basically changed discipline for my PhD. That's something that is in the German system means that you can't just do that. So it's a little bit different than this maybe in other countries. But for me, this really meant that in a way, as you can see also from the title, that I transferred methods or concepts from the field of theater studies to literary studies. And the main claim was that studying drama, you really need to study it as an intermediate script genre. So it's a text written to be performed. And that if you then look at self-reflexivity in these texts, then this actually means that you have to take into account not just the theater as a medium, but also the page, so the text as a medium, and there are also conventions pertaining to the text, how a drama looks like on the page. And this is something that can easily be, or can also be reflected as much as the medium or the apparatus of the theater, but that if you reflect on the textual medium, then this is actually something that can be very interesting then in the medium, in the transition from page to stage, because all of a sudden it's not that easy, don't have a one-to-one translation or adaptation that is possible, because it's really something that reflects on the written page and not on the different mediums. So in that way, I felt always a bit in between, in the sense that, as I said, I introduced methods into a different field, but that's something that's also, again, very specific for the German context, because if you are in the UK, this differentiation between studying drama and studying theater is something very specific for the German context. So if in Germany you study literature, you study drama, but if you do theater studies, you no longer study the text, you just study the performance. Whereas obviously in other countries, this is a less strict division. Then I moved on from there to Wuppertal. And I should mention that already also in my PhD, as I said, I used intermediate theory to kind of work on my main hypothesis. But what also interested me was the question of narration, but of discursive narration. So is there a narrator in place who speaks actually the stage direction? What kind of voice is that? Is that something that you can look at as a narrator? Are these are these instructions? And what happens again if you play with that, if you self-reflexively use that? So that is also why in my PhD I started becoming interested in narratology and specifically in transgeneric narratology. And so in Wuppertal, when I started there, they just had founded the Center of Narrative Research. So I was very active in that, and especially in a group that was called Narration in Film. I'm also very often going to the annual meetings of the International Society for the Study of Narrative, and I'm very happy to see that there are also now sometimes panels on plays, but this is something that's, of course, focused a lot on other media, but recently you can see that there's also, there's a lot of connection, of course, between narrative studies and intermediate studies, especially also with this idea of transmedia narration. And we heard that already also yesterday. It may look that in the German system, you're supposed to change the literature you're working on when you're in a literary department, which I was at that time in the English department. That's why I moved my postdoctoral projects to look at novels and short stories, but I did include plays, and I then started looking into this question of how Europe is imagined in contemporary British texts. So there's this idea of this transnational configuration and how this actually works in these texts, the idea of a transnational identity. And then Brexit happened, and all the texts that I had collected were kind of pointing in a different direction. So it's of course very interesting to then read later Brexit fiction and realize that this is not at all, it's actually, going back to a literature that is very much reflecting national identities and national issues, and this idea of a transnational opening is kind of abandoned. I also looked a bit further. Because of this idea of Britain in Europe, the way Europe is imagined in British literature is very much like the other. So I actually also moved into the field of post-colonial theory and post-colonial studies. And in a way, you could say that that's maybe one detour. And then with this, but in the projects, especially in the second one, I also looked beyond literature. So I looked also at performances and film for the Anglophone settler imagination. And then now that I'm professor of intermediate studies, for me, this feels like it's coming a bit to a round circle. These are my research interests I already talked about. And there are several projects related to it. Some of them don't have really a strong intermediate focus, but focus, for instance, still on self-reflexivity, which very often also connects to intermediality, because of course, intermediality when used in literature always also is self-reflexive. And also this question of genre is something that that comes back very often. I'm also still working on this Europe theme and trying to expand it more. But what I wanted to focus on is maybe more inspired also by what Agnes Peto presented yesterday, is this question of future interests and plans. What do I find particularly interesting, maybe also for my work, but in the years to come. And that's actually a combination of post-dramatic theater text and intermediate studies. And I'm particularly interested right now in the work of Milo Rau, who is producing theater, films, books, and is currently artistic director at the Ghent theater. But what interests me there is really his use. So it's a very intermediate theater. It's also a sort of you can call it theater of the real. So it's also a documentary theater where actors are, he doesn't really work with a fixed ensemble, but he always casts people to act in his films and on stage. So you could say that it's a sort of documentary theater. So in a way, it crosses several borders. It crosses medial borders. It is very much focused on migration as a theme, but since it uses video recordings, or one of his rules, he has he wrote a manifesto at the beginning of his artistic direction, where he said that he wants to produce also in other countries. So one example is Orestes in Mosul, where he really traveled to Mosul and he worked with actors there, or the New Gospel is something that he developed in Matera. So it is also this idea that his theater moves, and then the question is what happens, and especially what I'm interested in is what happens, let's put it very crudely, when a Western white male theater director comes to all these contexts with his group, with his artistic equipe, and what happens then if we have pre-recorded films, audio fragments, and all these intermediate phenomena integrated, for instance, in the theater, but also in a film. What happens in terms of multilingualism and translation? And the idea is that I want to explore this as political strategies. So the question is a bit the ethics of intermediality in contexts of intercultural encounter that are potentially complex and very lopsided. And I don't know, because I wanted to time myself and I didn't. So I'm looking at Camila, how much time I still have. Otherwise, I could try to show the trailer so that you have an idea.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah?
You have some minutes, yeah.
Okay, and let's see if it works also. Yeah, that's just so to illustrate. So the intermediate aesthetics is that there is really, he literally incorporates film on stage. You can here see it also how this results in a very strange doubling. So this is pre-recorded film, and then the same is actually happening on stage. And you could also say that because of the multilingualism, the actors usually speak in their mother tongue. So you have Arabic actors speaking Arabic on stage. So there are always these surtitles. So you also always have to read. So there's always also text and image relationships and live performance and pre-recorded film, but also live recording. He mixes that. So that's something you could also see in the trailer if this now works. Let's see. Do you hear the sound? No sound? Okay.
No, no sound.
What do I have to do? I think it's something here, right? Computer Ton freigeben.
Yeah, I think you have to change.
Yeah, I will try again if it's now. Can you hear it now? No, no, I can't hear anything.
When you share the screen, you have there is a little box for video and for sound.
Yeah.
So you have to unshare and then share again and
then make sure you check that box.
Yeah. Okay, so I unshare. And now I tick the box again. Okay.
I think it's still sharing, so you need to stop sharing and start again.
Ah, yeah, sorry. Yes. Okay. Sorry about this. So I will share it again. Okay, now something happened here. Voila. Can you hear it now? Okay.
Bizar om hier te zijn. Het is alsof ik in een televisieserie sta en tegelijkertijd in de klassieke oudheid.
Rooien bestaat niet meer.
لقد تمت تبرئة أرسطس. انتهت الحرب. انتهت الحرب.
هذا كان آخر مشهد صورناه بالموصل. مشهد غريب. انك تعفو عن قتلة بمدينة الناس كانوا متعذبين تحت سلطتهم.
Okay. Yeah, so you can see that it's very complex. So how do I get to the next slide? Ah, yeah, now I'm in this and I can't get, now I have to stop sharing, I guess, again, right? Yeah, okay, sorry, once again, let's see. I can't get out of my screen now. I can't see you. Wait. Let's try this. I cannot see you anymore. How do I close this? Okay, yeah, I'm sorry about, no, I can. Okay, sorry. Now, where are you? Here. And let's try, and let's move to this one. Okay. Now you should be able to see my PowerPoint again. So, so what interests me about this, and this is just one example. I believe that there are more works that kind of discuss or address similar issues. So one thing you could say is that if there's this pre-recorded video, which is then shown in performance, you have an intermediate relationship. Then you also have this live recording where actually then you could say that the reproduction, so the theater performance, is changed, is replaced by acts of production. So about that this is a filming that is happening live. So this idea of remediation, I think, is something that can be very interestingly used. At the same time, this means that there is a strong sense of self-reflexivity. And on the one hand, it brings what is shown closer. So it has like immersive emotional effects, but at the same time, this reflexivity, you've maybe noticed this, that this one actor says, this was the last scene we performed. And it's also literally when you have this one actress performing her role live on stage, and you have her doing this at the very same time with the sound of the video. This is also very, very strange and potentially reflexive. So that's something that interests me about these works. But what also interests me, and this traveling of media. So in this case, the actors, you saw one woman, they couldn't travel because they didn't get a visa. So they were only present on stage through the videos. So then this is actually something that exposed the power relationships in the traveling also of media. So this idea that media travel and how intermediality then becomes political is something that also this production in particular was criticized for. And then there is a third aspect that I find very interesting, and that's something that mainly pertains to Milo Rau, is this idea of transmedia narrative, because as I mentioned earlier, he's also usually always publishing a book with his performances. In the case of Orestes and Mosso, you even had a film which showed the making of. There's usually also a huge coverage by journalism. So it's also the idea to not just look at artistic media in this to look at this as a transmedial universe and expand it from the theater performance and film, which is a documentary film basically, to also have these non-artistic media. And Milo Rau, that's him, addresses this question of ethics also in the book, which is very interesting how this is then reflected. So it's basically, he says that I would say the intermediality of the production and this question of migration of media versus people and of boundaries between media versus countries, that this actually showed something that otherwise remains invisible. So he says that it was about equality, about going there and developing something together, but it is as if all the ethical issues return in one fell swoop, and that this is how art reveals what reality conceals. So that this is literally the making of an encounter, of a confrontation. So he's also reflecting these shortcomings that I think become very visible if you use an intermediate approach to this kind of theater. So this is also a slide to show what interests me about it. As I said, the transmedial aspect, this idea of verbal visual configurations of provincializing intermediality theory, but not by using a post-colonial corpus, but by really looking at power relations in the circulation and in the relations and in the in-between of media, and also the question, I think this also ties in with this question of genre, in the sense that we have to ask ourselves, so here I've talked about the documentary as a genre, for instance, but so I think that this question of media and genre relationships is also something that is potentially very interesting. So asking about whether there is a shift in my work, I would say that I come from a very broad in-between context of studies, which I took further in my research in a way, or I used in my research. But that for me, this being confronted with post-colonial theory and post-colonial research and the theater of the real is something that in a way really strongly more strongly attuned me to these questions of ethics. So in that way, you could say that there is a shift from aesthetics, which I also think you see in the field as such. Now we had it that it's intermediality as the study of art forms and as a very complex and maybe also typological discourse, to the questions more of politics and of ethics, and how then intermediality is indeed charged with political meaning. And this would be my ending, and thank you for listening. And I hope I didn't overstay the welcome.
Thank you very much, Janine. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting to know what you're working on, very interesting objects, and also about the activities for the group, the research group, very active research group. So thank you very much. So I will now move to our last presenter today, Mattia Petricola. Holds a postdoctoral position at University of L'Aquila, Italy, PhD in comparative literature and literary theory from the University of Bologna, and his work focuses on intermediate states between life and death in literature and cinema. So his research interests include intermediate studies, thanatology, speculative fiction, category theory, and he has published articles on Philip Dick, Peter Greenaway, queer hermeneutics, and the notion of spectrality in media studies. So thank you for being with us today, Mattia.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me and see the presentation here?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, okay, perfect. So now I will start with a very quick overview of my areas of expertise, the networks I am a part of, etc. Then I would like, so I'm going to start my timer because I forgot. Okay, that's running. Then I would like to turn this presentation as much as possible into a little narrative, into a little account of how I came to research what I research in intermediate studies, and introduce the areas and the questions I have been working on over the last 5 or 6 years. That is basically since the beginning of my PhD in 2015. For each area, I would like to start by focusing on a particular book or a film or an artwork that has influenced me in some way. And what you see here in the background is a still image from a video by Bill Viola, who is one of the artists who had and still has quite an impact on my research. So I have a background in Italian studies. I got my PhD from the University of Bologna and the University of L'Aquila, which was a joint PhD. And while in L'Aquila, I started working with Massimo Fusillo, who Marina mentioned yesterday, and he is the co-chair of the Committee for Literature, Arts and Media for the International Comparative Literature Association. After my PhD, I got a postdoc position at the University of L'Aquila, and actually I gave you maybe an old bio note. Now my contract with L'Aquila has ended, so I have no affiliation at the moment. And while in L'Aquila, I was part of a project spanning until 2022 called Transcodification, Literature, Arts and Media, which was clearly focused on intermediality. So my areas of expertise include fantastic fiction, which is an umbrella term which I use to include non-realistic, many forms of non-realistic fiction. The idea of non-realistic fiction is in itself quite problematic, but just bear with me. And this is an umbrella term which includes the supernatural, fantasy, science fiction, the weird, whatever comes to your mind. And I'm always working at the crossroads between fantastic fiction and thanatology. So the representation of death across media and the cultural history of death, dying and disposal. I also like to work on category theory and queer theory. I am basically interested in understanding how categories, taxonomies, and classification systems work, and in deconstructing them. And when you apply this deconstruction to identity categories, you find yourself in the realm of queer theory, which is something that goes far beyond the LGBT plus spectrum. So my work is very theoretical in that aspect. And I always try to work across media with a special attention to intermedia references, as I will explain in a moment. So I was one of the co-organizers of the conference Transcodification, Literature, Arts and Media, organized by the Committee on Literature, Arts and Media of the ICLA. And I'm happy to say that quite a few people that are participating in this conference today have been presenters at the ICLA conference in July. A selection of papers from this conference will be published by De Gruyter, and we are just beginning to work on this. And from 2022, so beginning next year, L'Aquila will have its own Center for Intermediality, which at the moment is active, but it's rather an informal network, and all will be formalized and officialized next year when the project on transcodification ends, and this will be what remains of the project as a lasting impact. I am also the ambassador for Italy for ASDS, the Association for the Study of Death and Society, which is a very interdisciplinary association based in the UK, which includes psychologists, social workers, doctors, funeral directors, sociologists, anthropologists, and there is a small number of people also working on death in literature, media, and the arts. And I've mostly published over these years in Between, which is the journal of the Italian Association for Comparative Literary Studies, and in Whatever journal, which is a transdisciplinary journal of queer theories and studies. So as I said, I have a background in Italian studies, very traditional with a philological approach, kind of old-fashioned, so as far removed from intermediality as you can imagine. The point is that I did not feel satisfied with focusing just on literature and in general on just one medium. So yesterday, Marion Froga talked about the undisciplinarité of intermedial studies, and I've always felt quite undisciplined or undisciplined myself. The experience of fiction and the experience of art in general is, I believe, always comparative and always intermedial. In any aesthetic experience and of any kind, all sort of different things come to your mind. You make all sort of associations with all sort of media. So it really is difficult to narrow down to just one medium in order to account for an aesthetic experience, which is what I like to do in my work. So I wanted to approach the study of fiction from a more complex angle, and this is why I moved to comparative literature and intermedial studies. I think the very first work which led me towards intermediality and that encapsulates in some sense my research is Philip K. Dick's Ubik, a science fiction novel from 1969. In this novel, people can be frozen at the moment of their death, literally frozen, in a state called half-life. And the living can talk to the half-lifers through a communication system that resembles, in some sense, sort of a telephone. This book was the point of departure for my thesis, which I am now turning into a book, which explores intermediate states between life and death that do not fall within the traditional taxonomy of the living dead. That is, zombies, ghosts, vampires, mummies, etc. So everything that you cannot really identify immediately as something, as an entity that belongs to a certain category. Well, that is the stuff my thesis is made of. And this book, Ubik, is also jam-packed with intermediate references. There are telephones, TV sets, radios, more advanced imaginary communication technologies, but also things like handwriting. And all these references contribute in a way that is absolutely fundamental to the semiotics and the aesthetics of Ubik. So their role in the novel is absolutely crucial. And in one of the chapters of my thesis, I explored the role of electronic media in Ubik. Studying Ubik led me further and further back in time, because I was trying to understand when exactly the residual undead, so living dead characters that do not fit into any specific category, emerged in the history of fiction. And so this led me further and further back in time, all the way to 1845, to Edgar Allan Poe's tale, The Facts. In the case of Mr. Valdemar, the protagonist here is mesmerized at the moment of death, and his existence sort of lingers on for several months after his death in a state of suspended animation. And what you see here in the illustration by Harry Clark is the moment in which the therapist deletes, cancels the suspended animation state and returns Valdemar to his normal state, and the body immediately decomposes. And while in Valdemar there are no explicit intermediate references, there is a communication problem that I find quite interesting. While Valdemar is in a state of suspended animation, he speaks, he talks to the therapist that put him into this state. And however, his voice does not actually come from his mouth. There is a sort of breakup in the materiality of communication that I believe is quite similar to the breakup we have when two people talk over the phone. And so there is another chapter in my thesis that's called Mr. Valdemar's Telephone. I published some preliminary results from my thesis in an article for whatever, called The Chinese Encyclopedia and the Living Dead, a queer approach to categorization and taxonomy in comparative literature. And my earliest, the research on Ubik there was really in its earliest stage, and it was published recently as a book chapter in the book that you see here, Lieu de vie en science-fiction. And my essay there was in French, and it was entitled Ideology and Ontology of Living Spaces in Ubik. And when working on this chapter from my thesis, I came across two classic monographs that have shaped most of my research in intermediality, which are Jeffrey Scones's Haunted Media and John Durham Peters' Speaking into the Air. And by reading Scones's argument in the light of Peters and vice versa, I tried to develop a framework for studying the notion of spectrality in media studies, which tries to complement, in some sense, the work that has been done in another recent classic, which is The Spectralities Reader, edited by María del Pilar Blanco and Esther Perren. In this reader, Tom Gunning provided a very concise but extremely useful definition of spectralities, and it's the one you see here, and I quote, "Beyond the literal sense of survival after death, ghosts as phantasms revealing hidden assumptions about the nature of the visual image still haunt our modern media landscape." So I decided to apply this framework to a work that I love very much, which is Namjoon Paik's TV Buddha. I saw this work for the first time in Berlin. I was on vacation in the years of my master's degree, if I remember correctly. It was definitely before my PhD. And at the time, I didn't know how important this work of art is, not only for the history of art, but also in the theory of media and in visual studies. And during my PhD, at one point, I got very interested in Paik and more in general in early video art, especially that from the 70s, and especially conceptual and abstract video art. I find that decade particularly fascinating because you can really see artists exploring video as a new medium and trying to understand what it can do and what its potential for creating art can be. So at one point I was very fascinated by that. And video also interests me because it was culturally construed and perceived in the cultural imagination as the most realist and realistic medium ever created, a medium capable of representing reality as it really is in real time. Of course, I'm not talking about media theory here. I'm talking about how video was perceived culturally as a new medium. So I'm talking about the cultural reception of video, if you want. Regarding this relation between video and reality, a couple of days ago, I was watching a documentary entitled VHS Lives, which is not surprisingly about watching and collecting VHS tapes. And at one point, this documentary shows a very nice commercial from 1983 for a new VHS tape called Memorex. And I would like to share it with you because it really encapsulates what I find fascinating about
Look at me. Do you like what you see? Good, because it's not me. It's a recording of me on new Memorex videotape. This remarkable tape has been recorded and re-recorded 100 times, but I bet you still couldn't tell if it was Memorex or me, which really isn't me. It's Memorex, new Memorex videotape. Even after 100 recordings, you'll wonder, is it live or is it Memorex?
Stand out.
Look at me. Do you like what you see?
So what Pike and other artists of the time try to do is exactly problematizing the relation between the world of video and the so-called real world that is thematized so with such great efficacy in this commercial, which plays on the inability on the part of the viewer to distinguish between video and reality. And video artists of the 70s tried to do the exact opposite. So I developed, as I said, a little theory of video spectrality to explore how video artists interrogated video not only in its relation with reality, but also as a potential getaway to a different dimension, which has nothing to do with representation and reality. So I explored these issues in two works. One is a chapter written in Italian, and the title would translate as The Electronic Gateway, Video and Its Specters from Nanjun Pike to Bill Viola, which was published in the book, in the essay collection that you see there on the right. In Italian, I would really like to translate the essay I wrote for this collection and publish it in English at some point. This is one of my very short projects. And the other article is in English. It's entitled Watching God in the Electronic Noise, Philip K. Dick, Bill Viola in the Video Art of Speculative Fiction, in which I study a scene from another novel by Philip K. Dick, A Scanner Darkly, another classic of science fiction. And I tried to put this scene in relation with Bill Viola's Information, the work that you saw just a few moments ago. So this concludes the second section of this presentation. And now I would like to talk about the third area of research in intermediality I am involved in at the moment. It is an area which focuses this time on on a specific artist, that is Peter Greenaway, who has now been active for more or less 50 years, maybe more. He has experimented with painting, drawing, installation art, film, television, opera, digital art, and museum curatorship. He really is, to me at least, one of the great intermedial artists of our age. And it all began when I watched his most famous film, The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover. And you see a still image from the film here in the PowerPoint. So this film, The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover, represents, to a certain extent, one of the apotheoses of Baroque and neo-Baroque filmmaking. As you can see here, there are paintings, there are intermediate references to the golden age of Dutch painting, there are still lives, the action is set in one sort of gigantic theater, the soundtrack and the costumes play a huge part in the film, and there is even cooking and haute cuisine and cannibalism, but that's another story. So it's basically a theme park for the study of intermediate references. And once again, my fascination for this film led me to explore Greenaway's oeuvre as widely as I could. So I started a research project, which is still ongoing, which I return to from time to time, in which I try to focus each time on a specific work by Greenaway and analyze it each time through a different theoretical framework. So I try to establish sort of one-on-one relationships between a text and a methodology. So my first attempt at this was in 2017, when I published an article called Al-Hilim and Al-Itim, Peter Greenaway and the Cinematic Trauerspiel. The Trauerspiel is the German word for mourning play, and it was explored by Walter Benjamin in The Origins of German Tragic Drama. And in this article, I try to establish a connection. I try to demonstrate that the cook, the thief, his wife, and her lover could actually be read through the lens of Benjamin's reflection on German tragic drama, which Benjamin had a sort of a wider definition of the Trauerspiel. According to him, it was not limited to the German world, but was a theatrical form that embraced all the Baroque in Europe. So there's much reflection there also on the relationship between Peter Greenaway and the Baroque and the Neo-Baroque. The second attempt, I tried to look at a trilogy by Greenaway called The Tall Snooper Suitcases in the light of the theory of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. And this essay was published in the book that you see on the right that Marina mentioned yesterday, the Gesamtkunstwerk as a synergy of the arts, edited by Massimo Fusillo and Marina Grishakova. And my third and last attempt to this date is trying to read a work that this time that Greenaway made together with Tom Phillips for television, Attività, which an adaptation of 13 cantos from Dante's Inferno for British television. And this time I tried to apply the theory, the reception theory, and the studies on the reception of Dante in the 20th century. And this last article was part of a collection of articles that I co-edited with Caroline Fischer, which was called Intermedial Dante, Reception, Appropriation, Metamorphosis. And on that occasion, we also published a conversation with Lars, which was called, if I remember correctly, Everything is Intermedial, a conversation with Lars Ellesholm. So as you can see here, there are not many recent works from 2021. This is why this year I mostly worked on thanatology and on queer death. So I published on that side, which has not very much to do with intermedial studies, at least not in the way I worked on this during this year. And now I'm trying to work on new, and also because I'm trying to work on new research projects, I think I've had enough of dead people or people who are about to die, etc. And I'm ready to move on to other projects, always maintaining a focus on intermediality. At this moment, I'm particularly interested in the representation of nerds and fans and fandoms, and in general of people who are involved in fiction and who define their identity by experiencing fiction. So that's it for me, and thank you very much, and back to you, Camila.
Sorry, thank you, Mattia. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting approach, very interesting objects of studies. And I think, well, I have some, I have written down some things here, which I would just like to comment here while everyone organize their thoughts, perhaps, so we can have some questions. Some things that that called my attention during the presentations. It was first this idea that that right in the beginning, right, when you all you three started working with intermediality, this idea of not being satisfied or not feeling that the tools that you had were enough to talk about, right? As Clodagh said, I didn't have the language to talk about it. So this thing that motivated is this this perception that what we once had was not enough to explain what we had in our hands, right? The objects that we wanted to deal with. So that was something that really called my attention, because with me it happened the same. It was the same with me. So it was very interesting to notice how this was something present, right, in all the three presentations. And also the idea, this idea of power and political issues permeating everything, very interesting, something that and how intermediality can serve, right, can be useful to also to deal with these issues, right? It's not something that is that is this idea of how intermediality can serve as a tool to an analysis of political and sociological and power relations, you know, outside so some things related to society, right? So something that that called my attention to, that was present in some way or another. So yeah, thank you, Mattia, for the. So Mattia has written down the links of the references, the journals. Yeah, so thank you very much. So does anyone have a question? Some comments?
Maybe I would like to comment a little bit. And first of, can I?
Sure.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to agree on the talks. Thank you very much, Mattia, Janine, and Clodagh. By the way, Mattia, your dissertation is very close of my dissertation. So after, I'd like to talk, yes, because I work at about I try to work with a concept of the reenchantment of the world by the techniques, and I work a lot with the phantasmagory, and well, your references are my reference. So later, and another opportunity, I'd like very much to talk about with you. But today I noticed that in two presentations, Janine and the first presentation, excuse me, we had a kind of a movement in a way that we are trying to approach the intermediality and the politics in the ethics. And this is, in my point of view, it's very interesting. In a Brazilian perspective or a South American perspective, this is a very interesting point because we put together the problem with the cultural representation and the apparatuses that we use to the representation. So Janine, my question is being addressed to you because you talked about the post-colonial question, politics, and the provincializing Europe from Chakrabarti. It's very interesting. I don't know if you are working with the colonial fall. This is one question. And the main question in Brazil and South America is, in these terms, in intermediality and cultural representation, affects and this kind of subjects, is how do you see this problem of the expression of cultural difference and the problem of the apparatus that has already our program? Understand me? Because the apparatus has a kind of cliche of representation. So when we are here, how can we represent ourselves if we are we have this problem of the apparatus? If you could talk a little bit about that, I would appreciate. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, one thing is that, of course, I don't have a, like if we talk about Milo Rau, then of course it's all about also neo-colonialism, and his latest film was about the workers, the field workers that are exploited and are undocumented migrants. So this all plays a role. I think what I find interesting in a way is that the post-colonial discourse, to a certain extent, was about giving a voice to minority groups and representing them. And that, I think, this question of representation is more complex, that by giving a voice to, or by showcasing someone, that's not there. I think that what this shows, or what I found particularly interesting, is that media in this particular performance is that media travel so easily. So the audio clips from the mobile phones or the recorded videos, and people don't. And then also, as you rightly said, I think this question of genre that I just flagged in a way comes in as well, that, for instance, you have this documentary aesthetic. You also have a theater aesthetic, where also the question is like when these, in the case of the Orestes in Mosul, they're actually people who study acting in Mosul, and they have you could say they have a different way of, a different style of acting. So it's also this clash that is reflected in these performances. So this all comes into all aspects that play a role, and I think need to be addressed. So I think it's very interesting to look at these questions, and that aesthetics in that way, isn't innocent. That's maybe I don't know if that suffices, but it's a discussion I think that needs to be that we should all contribute to.
Thank you. It's a huge problem. Thank you.
Alex, could I just come in and just say something as well on the kind of Italian perspective?
Oh yes, please, Clodagh. I was thinking about you. Okay.
Yeah. Because I mean, I could see quite a lot of links between the work that we've done and with the work that Janine has done as well. And I'm very curious about her work, and I'll catch her offline as well to talk about it a little bit more. But I was working on the early 21st century, and we have quite a lot of artworks and art being done at that time that is definitely using intermediality in a very political kind of way. Specifically, taking Henriette Jenkins' ideas of convergence and moving it into an Italian context, which is quite actually quite subversive. So kind of subverting Henry Jenkins in quite an obvious sort of way with writers like Fu Ming, and making a political space out of this, I think, and Janine said it here as well, this easy ability of the artworks to move across different platforms. So I do think there's a very strong political message, and that might link up to my question that I asked sort of at the end of my own paper, with how do we get outside of the academia with this? And there may be a link between those two different things, the politics, the ethics, and intermediality. I think they're curious and perhaps an underdeveloped area of intermediality. Just sorry to kind of jump in there, but I just wanted to say that.
Might I just jump in there as well in the same way, because this is something how intermediality and the aesthetics and ethics and politics connect. I was struck by the first two presentations, that these questions to what do we do with the knowledge we have acquired, with our ability to analyze this complexity, that we have found this language that you, Clodagh, in the beginning said that you lacked. And I think this is, as somebody already said in the chat, I think these are really, really important questions, and also connect to the question, how do we reach out? And I think in both in your, Janine's, and your, Clodagh's presentations, there are two different, I mean, there are different ways to go, and one is to connect intermediality with other theories, or see the connections as combining intermediality, and asking about these kind of connections, what different media, if they combine. This is not only self-reflective reflection about media, but seeing it in a kind of performative way, like it does something, and what does it do? This is maybe something that I will talk about later, but also about seeing this connection, about these complexity that we all are using to, or that we analyze in mainly kind of aesthetic media products, but realizing and seeing, drawing the connection to communication in the digital age, where there are all kind of complex interactions between different kinds of media types, and transformation and self-reflexivity and everything. And I think in the general social life, we do not have the language, or we do not have really the literacy for it. So usually in these kinds of contexts, and I think Lars is aware, I usually have this kind of, over these kinds of visionary phrasings, but then I start to speak about something like intermediality as a kind of intermediate media literacy, and which is, of course, a huge, I mean, because then we have to adapt what we know to different contexts, and to translate, as you said, when reaching out, to translate what we analyze to other forms, to more not only aesthetic communication, but more social context. But I think it's not only worth it; it's really, as somebody said, it's really necessary, because a lot of things that are going on in communication in the digital sphere, or in how it affects society, connect to that. If you combine and transform, if you move narratives across media, if you combine different kinds of media types, then you affect what you communicate. And apparently, we aren't always in control of it.
Yeah, Lars?
Thank you.
Yeah, just a brief comment here, because I've also been thinking a lot about the connection between intermedial multimodal theory and the rest of the world, so to speak. Especially since I'm quite focused in my own research to the very abstract conceptual ideas quite often. But I think that, I mean, it's not difficult to make people understand what intermediality is all about, especially if you focus on the transmedial aspect. How meaning, information, knowledge, etc., is transferred among different media all the time. So one simple way of making like perhaps 3 or 4 years kids really understanding what it is about would to be, you know, play the Chinese whisper game. So ask someone to whisper something in the ear of another guy, and then you ask the other guy to make a drawing, for instance, and then you make the third guy verbalize this drawing again, and it will clearly be a different outcome in the end. So these transmedial, these transfers, transmediations, they are everywhere all the time. And intermedial research can offer concepts to analyze and understand that. But then it's up to each and everyone to decide, of course, what kind of empirical material you want to work with, having these concepts. And then you can approach virtually anything, everything. Because in my view, these transmedial aspects are everywhere in communication, in daily, casual conversation, and also in areas of the highest importance. I mean, it's not a long step to go from these questions to, well, at Linnaeus University, where Beate and I work, we have gone in the direction of investigating like what happens in trials, in courtrooms, when information is disseminated among people, what happens in classrooms, when you try to, when the teachers teach like the hard sciences and other things, how is that done with the aid of different kinds of media powders and so forth. And one active group works with trustworthiness, truthfulness, and so forth, connecting to ideas like fake news and disinformation and so forth. I mean, it's extremely relevant there, of course, with these transmedial aspects. And another group also works then with the Anthropocene and climate change and so forth. So how is knowledge communicated so that it reaches a lot of people, not just the specialists. And there the idea of investigating artistic and non-artistic media types is extremely vital, because our knowledge about climate change and environmental issues is produced within scientific communities that publish articles and so forth that are not easily understood. But most people understand these things through like movies and novels and so forth. So what happens when you move between these areas? Well, those are issues of transmediation, and hence core parts of what intermedial theory can do to help understanding things.
That's great. Thanks, Lars. It's great to hear some of the responses to that. The question of translation, I think, that you also mentioned earlier, and it's part of my world as well in modern languages, is an important one there in terms of translating concepts from one potentially non-fictional field into another fictional field. So yeah, I think, and I love the example of the Chinese whispers through different media. I won't be afraid of 2 to 4-year-olds anymore after that.
No, I've never tried it myself, but the result is obvious. We know what will happen, don't we?
Absolutely. I'll be trying it out in the local school though as soon as I get out of here. Great.
Anybody else would like to comment or any other questions? Okay, yeah, okay, so I think, so I would like to thank everybody again for being here. Thank our colleagues, our 3 colleagues, for accepting the invitation and taking their time to share their experiences in this meeting with people from different cultures and languages, so diverse perspectives of research. It's been very, very rich. And so today we have another roundtable, the last one at 1:30 p.m. Brazilian time. Okay, so it's going to start a little bit earlier. And then after the roundtable, we are going to have an informal meeting, so we can just talk about what these 3 days have been, what it has been to us, and also to talk a little bit about our Brazilian experience in the 2 research groups that we are part of. And so everyone is invited for this program, this part in the afternoon. And I would like, just to wrap it up, I would like to ask if everyone would like to just turn on their camera so we can have a print screen of this session. So yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. So who's going to take it? Medium, please.
One second, let me see if it worked. Yes, it did. Thank you so much. So we need to find a way to transmediate the coffee break. That's the thing that I miss the most.
Yeah, we still haven't got this, no.
So
okay, so everyone, thank you very much. It was
Thank
great.
you. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Camila.
Foi
lindo, foi ótimo, Camila, foi lindo,
bom,
foi muito
adorei,
bom.
Gostei muito. Olha, e eu fiquei doida com esse livro que a menina falou. Já mandei comprar.
Ó.
Qual que é, Thaís?
Ótima, ela já mandou comprar na hora.
Visual Configurations in Post-Colonial Literature. Porque
Sim, eu printei
Pois
ele.
é, porque é o seguinte, eu já comprei um monte de coisa sobre a literatura pós-colonial, desde que eu comecei com o Shonibari, mas eu comecei a fazer um projeto, achei que estava muito michuruca e parei. Só que eu já comprei uma porção de coisa aqui que chama intermedialidade visual na pós-colonial. E essa aqui, inclusive, que a Gabriele Ripple é uma das autoras, né? Aí esse aqui está para mim. Agora, ele é caríssimo, R$1.013. Aí, meu filho está em Londres, ele vem o mês que vem. Aí, como ele está me pedindo um dinheiro, eu escrevi para ele, você compra o livro aí, que eu te peço dinheiro aqui.
Ai, é. Ô, gente, bom demais. Camila, e foi muito bom que deu tempo da pergunta. Ai, gente, tem que ter, né? Tem que ter.
Tem que ter, né? Assim, a gente passou um pouquinho, né, Miriam? Assim,
mas não tem
porque
problema.
estava marcado 10 horas, mas assim, eu vi que a Janine atrasou um pouquinho, e aí, tipo assim, o Mattias tinha que ter o tempo dele, e depois, assim, uma pena não ter discussão nenhuma, porque, assim, as coisas que surgiram na discussão foram maravilhosas, entendeu? Essa ideia da Clodagh, né, da aplicação da intermedialidade para além da universidade, assim, muito legal.
Eu adorei, viu? Gostei demais.
Não, e assim,
interessante.
Essa mesa ela ficou mais curtinha, né? Em vez de até 10h30, ficou só até 10, 1h30. 1h30 é muito pouco, né? Acho que é 2. Eu acho que o pessoal ficou, todo mundo ficou. Eu fico acompanhando a parte técnica aqui. Ninguém saiu, né? Então, assim.
Miriam, agora deixa eu te falar, isso foram gravadas?
Está sendo, Thaís, ali, ó, tá gravando, eu tô olhando, tá? Teve uma que não foi, porque foi um dia que deu uma coisinha no sistema, e aí começou a gravar já lá no terceiro, né? Mas acontece, essas coisas acontecem, mas está tudo gravadinho. Depois a gente tem que ver com a Ana como que, né? A gente pode ter acesso, né?
Porque eu perco muito com negócio oralmente, eu perco demais, quando eu vejo, já esqueci, estou pensando em outra coisa, e eu gosto de ler, né? Então, eu pelo menos ler de novo com calma.
E tem muita referência, por exemplo, desse pessoal, na hora que eles colocam os slides, tem muita coisa que eles passam rápido, a gente não consegue pegar. Aí,
pois
né, assim,
essa menina, né, ela botou um monte de grupos, de coisas que eu gostaria de ter anotado. Então, na hora que tiver gravado, a gente pode ver.
A Janine, meu Deus, que maravilha aquele grupo dela lá na Bélgica.
Não, todos, né? O que é isso, gente? A cada grupo, eu tô assim, esse evento eu vou arrumar alguém para fazer pós-doc, mas agora eu não sei se eu quero ir para o México, se eu quero ir para Portugal, se eu quero ir para Irlanda, eu quero ir para todos os lugares, meu Deus.
Essa mulher da Irlanda eu achei sensacional.
Maravilhosa.
Muito.
Agora, gente, nós estamos segurando o Paulo aqui, né? Vamos liberar ele, o da Socializa. Paulo, você tá aí, Paulo? Nós vamos te liberar, né? Mas a gente, Camila, a gente precisa, viu, Thaís? A gente precisava fazer um encontro para a gente conversar, né? Vamos marcar.
Não, e é o seguinte, como eu fiquei com esse treco, hoje eu estou aqui tomando sorvete, botando... Dormi com uma bolsa de gelo na cara.
Ai, meu Deus.
Passei agora a
Pablo,
mensagem para a dentista. Ela falou assim, você pode me encontrar às 2 horas? Eu falei, não. Eu vou tomando sorvete, botando gelo, mas não posso. Só lá depois de 6 horas da tarde. Aí vai dar, né? Mas eu estou me controlando, tá ótimo. Gostei demais.
Muito bom. Nossa, não, eu estou achando sensacional. Então, gente, vamos lá. Aí, 1h30 nós estamos aqui,
1h30, beleza.
Isso aí, ó.
Combinado.
Camila, maravilha, viu? Você foi super guest, ali, chair, maravilhosa.
Foi muito
profissional,
bom, né?
Profissional.
Mas também os convidados ajudam, né? Também.
Ajuda, né?
O link é a mesma coisa, né?
É o mesmo.
Sim, sempre o mesmo, Thaís.
Eu até mandei para a Solange para ver se ela conseguia.
Pois é.
Pior que eu, né? Não sei quem é pior, se é eu ou ela.
Acho até parece as duas maravilhosas.
Ela entrar.
Thaís, você viu a apresentação do Mattia, da pesquisa dele, do Peter Greenaway? Lembrei de você na hora.
Pois é, e olha, sabe que eu lembrei, quando eu vi aquela figura, que eu já vi esse filme há muitos anos, que ele passou muito tempo, ele foi
gravar,
antes
né?
do Prosperous Book, né? E tem na hora que ele pôs a mesa, me lembrei do Inca Shonibare, porque...
exatamente! Aquela cena da The Last Supper, né? Assim.
Aí eu falei, gente, essa imagem aí mexeu comigo. E eu já vou botar o Shonibare no...
Shonibare junto com o Greenaway.
Nossa!
E achei muito legal.
Maravilha.
Muito legal.
Nossa,
mesmo.
não,
Legal,
muito bom.
Bacana.
Ai. Ô, gente, dá vontade de ficar aqui, né? Tomando café, mas... Né? Vamos lá para a sala do chimarrão.
Ontem eu não vi nada, né? Porque ontem eu estava perto, né? Então eu não vi nada que você coordenou, nada disso.
Mas eu não coordenei nada ainda, não. Hoje à tarde.
O dela vai ser hoje à tarde.
Então tá. porque adorei
Está
a Camila.
tranquilo.
Foi muito bem, viu, Camila?
Foi. Mas eu acho que todas as mesas estão boas, né, Camila? Nossa, tá tudo bom. E assim, eu acho que cada um tem sua personalidade, né? Assim.
Ô, Miriam, outra coisa que eu acho é o seguinte, até na hora que você me falou o negócio, eu mandei para você, né, a minha apresentação, depois eu fiquei lembrando, porque como o tempo era pequeno, eu pus tudo muito geral. Mas se a gente pensar todas as
muita coisa. Não dá para apresentar, não.
As teses, as dissertações, depois de 2000, todas foram
são de intermedialidade. Pois é, aí, Thais, olha só, eu fiz um compilado mesmo, tá? Assim, tentei juntar, mas de uma maneira para ficar rápido, porque a gente não quer cansar também, né, o pessoal. Eu pensei assim, 15 minutos. Aí eu juntei, mandei para o Alex, porque ele que é bom dessa coisa estética lá, né? Mas aí a gente ficou pensando assim, será que dá tempo e tal? Ele falou que ia ver, que ia pensar. E uma ideia que eu tive, assim, que me passou pela cabeça, mas talvez vá dar trabalho demais, às vezes é melhor apresentar rapidinho, seria gravar um vídeo e mandar